Gospel Tangents is supported by users like you. Please support us at gospeltangents.com or on Patreon. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to do a flashback episode, this time with Dr. Brian Hales. This is our first interview back in 2017 with Brian on his 3 books on Joseph Smith's Polygamy. So it's proved to be not only popular with listeners, but popular with anti-Mormon and polygamy skeptics. A lot of people like to take pot shots at Brian, and you know, they don't want to do what it takes to build good relationships with people. I've been disappointed that there's been a few unethical podcasters that have taken clips from this video without permission. Anyway, I got in a big argument with one jerk, and he advertised it as the interview Rick Bennett doesn't want you to see. I want you to see this interview. I'm publishing it on my channel. I don't want you to watch it on anybody else's channel because they didn't ask for permission. They ignore copyright laws and rules. And anyway, I just don't have any respect for those people who do that. So anyway, and I just want to mention a few people do reach out, and I do give permission. Gerardo from Mormon Stories, Michelle Stone has asked for a few things, so I'm not talking about them. And I don't want to tell you who those people are that are unethical, because I don't want you to watch their crap. But anyway, this is a great interview with Brian. It is funny to see how I've learned a lot since 2017 about polygamy. But Brian was very gracious, and I wanted to show this for the first time, the entire interview. So this is a kind of a throwback episode for that. So hope you enjoy our interview with Brian Hales on Joseph Smith's Polygamy. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody out here to Gospel Tangents podcast. I'm really excited to talk to Dr. Brian Hales. He's the expert on polygamy, or one of the experts, I guess. And so grateful to have you here, and thank you for letting me take some of your time today.
Rick, it's really a privilege for me to be here.
All right. Well, thanks. So one of the things I would like to do is just to introduce you to my audience a little bit. Now, typically I try to talk to a lot of historians who are doctors, but you're the first physician, although I have talked to a physician's assistant as well. So just could you tell us a little bit about your background, even in medicine? I think you're a Utah man, is that right?
I am, actually. I went to Utah State, grew up in Logan, and got a medical degree from the University of Utah. So I have a little bit of the Ute blood in me as well.
And Utah, okay.
And Aggie primarily. And then had a member of my family who was involved with Mormon fundamentalism, and that kind of steered me over into thinking about polygamy. And this was back in 1989, so it's been quite some time ago. And I, at that point, was in a residency for anesthesia. And I do tell people that my books are part of my full anesthesia services. So you've probably heard me say that joke. But I got interested then in Mormon fundamentalism and published a book, co-authored a book in 1991 dealing with that topic, and then later a couple of other books. But people were asking me about Joseph Smith's polygamy, and I didn't have answers. And really, I would argue none of the books did. Todd Compton's book had some things that were very helpful, but he had written biographies, and it wasn't focused specifically on Joseph. So there was still a lot of room for research, and to also try to figure out some of the historical aspects that really were just big question marks, I think, in a lot of people's minds. So in 2006, 2007, I hired Don Bradley, who is a dear friend, but also a remarkable researcher. And he went out and did a lot of research for me, gathered documents. And I told him, get everything, anti-Mormon or supportive, whatever he could find. Now, we wanted to get every known document. And it was interesting because after we'd been going about 6 months, it became obvious that if we kept going, eventually we would be able to put either a transcript or at least a reference to every known document on polygamy within the volumes that we were putting together. And so we got kind of excited about that, but that was mostly Don Bradley's work. But with his help, I put together 3 volumes on polygamy. And there's been a few new things come out. This was in 2013 that they were published, but not a lot has come out. But a very important thing that we can talk about.
Yeah, we'll definitely want to talk about that. So, well, great. I'm glad you talked about how you got interested in fundamentalist Mormonism, I guess. There are different branches. Could you just kind of briefly give a sketch of the main ones? I guess we've got FLDS, AUB. Are there any other? Could you kind of give a little background on Mormon fundamentalism?
Well, do you mind if I just talk about what's going on in Canada?
Sure, that'd be great.
Now, I just got back on what was last week, a week ago today, from Cranbrook, Canada. And that is where they're holding a trial right now for two leading polygamists, Winston Blackmore and James Oler. And the Canadian government has a kind of a different system than we have here in the United States, in that they have a law against polygamy. It's been on the books since 1899 or before. They haven't prosecuted anybody in the last 100+ years. But what they're able to do in Canada that we don't do in the U.S. is that they can petition their Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of a particular law. And so in 2012, they did this to the state, well, it'd be the province of British Columbia, to the provincial court, saying, is this polygamy law constitutional? And they ruled that it was. And so they are now prosecuting the two leading polygamists, because there's a group of hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds, located about an hour and a half away from Cranbrook, where the court's being held. And so the prosecution, the attorneys called me up and said, would you come up and be an expert? They said, we don't want you to testify for or against. And I told them, that isn't what I was interested in doing. But they wanted somebody to give an accurate history, which is something that I had studied. So I can even give you a copy of a chart that I've updated, and you can put it in the show notes or however you do online if people are interested. It's available at MormonFundamentalism.com. But they asked me just to come up and start with Joseph Smith and go right through on authority to the 1890 and 1904 manifestos, the period between that and the fundamentalist groups coming together at the end of the 1920s, and then the branches and the breakoffs, and I put together a nice little chart that talks about the different groups, and of course the fundamentalists up there, the polygamists up there were aligned with the FLDS. But in 2002, Winston Blackmore was excommunicated by Warren Jeffs over kind of an interesting situation where Warren, representing his father Rulon, who'd had strokes and was not necessarily communicating that much, but Warren gave the word that Winston was supposed to actually take the life of a woman who had been involved with what he felt was a transgression within their religious beliefs, and Winston refused to do it, so he was excommunicated. So this was before Warren had actually taken over. James Oler is the other leader, and when Winston was excommunicated as the bishop up there, then James Oler took over. But kind of a sad tale. My heart actually goes out to both of these guys. I don't agree with their polygamy, but the sad thing is that James Oler helped with that 2012 case where they brought up the constitutionality of the anti-polygamy law. And James Oler was just a friend of the court, or gave an opinion on that. And then it came out that against the polygamists, and Warren was unhappy with that and has sent him out to repent from afar, which takes away his wives and everything. And he seems like a really nice guy. I only chatted with him, exchanged very few words, but he seemed like a very humble man. And again, I want it known that I am not up there to testify against the polygamists. There's been some people saying that isn't true. I was totally neutral on that. And Rick, I don't know if you want to know this, but personally, I don't think we should allow polygamy either in Canada or the United States. But my reason might be a little surprising to you, because in a country or government that allows same-sex marriage, and again, I'm not speaking for or against that, but if we allow same-sex marriage and we allow polygamy, you could have networks of people, hundreds of people, all married to each other in a variety of ways. And if the government privileged marriage, in other words, if a married man or a married woman, whatever kind of marriage it is, if they have a privilege a single person doesn't have, then everybody's going to want to be married in some way. And I think it would force the government to basically get out of the marrying business and leave it as a social construct or a religious agreement. But in doing that, they would also take away any privilege for marriage, which I think could harm the family. And so that's my reasoning for saying I don't think we should have legal polygamy. I think a society can absorb polygamy on a small scale that obviously can't be practiced widely because of the differences in people, the male and female, the gender differences in being born. But I don't think a society can absorb both of the expansions of marriage at the same time. I mean, you can do same-sex marriage or you could do polygamy. I don't think it's good for the family to do both.
Okay. Well, very interesting. All right. Well, let's move on. In your book, you talk. You've got a 3-volume set, I guess I should say. And one of the other things that I wanted to talk about was I had an interview with Dr. Mark Staker. I don't know if you were able to watch those interviews.
Just a part of it.
Okay, so in one of those interviews with Dr. Mark Staker, he really surprised me when he said that he thought that Black Pete was the first Black Mormon into the church, baptized just about 6 months after, may have introduced polygamy to Kirtland. Which kind of blew my mind. I'd never heard that before. And I wanted to, you're kind of an expert on the Kirtland era polygamy and that as well. I wanted to get your opinion on that point.
Mark, who is a remarkable scholar, and you don't dismiss anything that someone who's done his level of research comes up with. You don't dismiss it just out of hand. You want to entertain it and see how it fits with the other building blocks. But Mark and I have actually exchanged emails and had conversations, and we actually have some disagreements on a number of points.
Okay.
I am aware of this from your podcast, and I think that Joseph Smith didn't need Black Pete to introduce him to polygamy, the idea. We see this all the time with say, the Book of Mormon. The critics will say, well, Joseph got this idea of Noah in Mosiah. Noah is actually, this person in Joseph's life, and they'll try to draw these parallels and things. And it's interesting talk, but I don't think it's all that necessary. I mean, Joseph knew the Old Testament. He knew Abraham had more than one wife, and Jacob. So why would we need to think that it was Black Pete that was actually introducing this in a very real way, especially when Joseph wasn't supportive of so much that was going on when he first arrived down there, and the types of spiritual experiences that they were expressing in their church meetings and things like that. So I'm a little dubious on that, but I just applaud Mark. I say go forward and let us know. The timeline lines up pretty well with Joseph having been translating the Old Testament, particularly the discussion about the patriarchs who were polygamists in 1831, when we also have them talking about marrying Lamanites, if we believe W.W. Phelps's revelation that he recounted decades later. So I think the chronology of him actually bringing up the question as he's translating fits the evidence a little bit better. But with Mark Staker, he may have other evidence I haven't seen, and we'll just have to wait for it.
Yeah. So. Well, Mark did admit that it was more of a circumstantial case, so not strong evidence. But he said Black Pete was seen as an Indian, which he's Black, but whatever. He said early in the Mormon Church, they said, "Well, you're Black. You must know what Indians are all about." And so that's kind of how it started. And Indians are polygynous, and so he thought maybe that might have been something. So anyway, interesting thought I'd never heard before. But let's go back to that timeline because Black Pete. The record only shows him from about 1830 to 1831, which is this time period. If you read section 132 in the Doctrine and Covenants, it says that portions of the revelation may have been received as early as then. Mark said, well, it could have been Black Pete that maybe tried to influence polygamy among the Kirtland saints, and that may have been why Joseph turned to the Bible and looked at polygamy and Abraham, as you mentioned. So my question is, well, there's a few questions. One of the interesting things, and I'm just going to reveal my opinion, polygamy is one of the most difficult topics for me to wrestle with theologically. And as we look at, let's talk about Doctrine and Covenants 132, it says in there that God gave Abraham the wives. It seems to me, if Joseph Smith is translating the book of Genesis, or retranslating it, and he made some changes in the book of Genesis, if you read that story in Genesis, it seems pretty clear that it wasn't God, it was Sarah that said, Abraham, why don't you take Hagar? And so it seems to me, if Joseph Smith's translating that, wouldn't there have been maybe a revelation there, or a Joseph Smith translation? He leaves that story basically unchanged. Do you have any comments on that?
There's at least a couple of ways that that could be interpreted, at least in my view. There are people who say Joseph knew all of Section 132 in 1831. I'm not one who believes that at all. I believe that he may have learned in 1831 that plural marriage was a correct principle. And that's kind of the language some of the brethren use, that he learned it was a correct principle. In other words, Abraham wasn't sinning or transgressing by practicing polygamy. The Bible does not teach anything about whether polygamy is good or bad. All we know is that Abraham practiced it, and Abraham was a friend of God. We can get that from the scriptures. So Joseph may have just gone with this question about, is this a valid practice? What was the second question?
Joseph Smith translation leaves the biblical story unchanged, that in DNC 132 it says God gave the wives.
The other thing is that in the Bible, there's nobody commanded to practice polygamy ever. But we have in Section 132 that Abraham was commanded by God to give Hagar, to marry Hagar. And so I don't think Joseph knew any of this in 1831. If we follow Joseph's teachings, even on something like eternal marriage, we find a hint of it in 1835. But still, there's nothing there. And I'm not sure, and I think Mark would disagree with me on this, Mark Staker, but I don't think Joseph was fully apprised of the authority and what it could do that he received in the temple on April 3rd, 1836 from Elijah and Moses and Elias. I honestly am not sure he understood that authority until maybe some years later. But that's speculation on my part. We certainly don't have him teaching anything about plural marriage or eternal marriage until we get into Nauvoo in the late 1840s. I'm sorry, late 1840, early 1841.
Okay.
So did I cover that?
Well, so I guess my question is, as far as 132 and Genesis, does it seem to you that there's a difference among those two scriptures, as far as whether God commanded Hagar to be a plural wife, or whether Sarah was totally responsible?
And because the Genesis, even the Joseph Smith translation, states
it leaves that story
Sarah
unchanged.
Was the driver and not God through Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
I believe all of these principles came to Joseph line upon line, precept on precept. And some of the exciting things that are happening down at BYU, Tom Wayman and others are looking at the Joseph Smith translation very carefully and discovering that it really shouldn't be thought of as actual scripture in and of itself, that it was a chance for Joseph to expand upon the text and to make the Bible text correspond with the theology that he was receiving through revelations or through communications he portrayed to be from God. And so for me to see the JST Genesis, and that it doesn't necessarily say what comes in 1843, doesn't surprise me because of the line upon line, precept on precept process.
Okay, well, that's good. All right. So in talking with Dr. Staker, one of the things that he also mentioned, well, let me back up a little bit. Claire Barris gave a presentation at a Mormon history conference in which he said that there was no documentation of any polygamy revelations prior I wish I remembered this exactly, but I believe 1838, that there's no documentation of that until about 1838. And that's when you first start to get the first points of documentation. So, but in talking with Dr. Staker, one of the things that he mentioned was, I believe it was 1835, you have the Declaration on Marriage, which was originally a section in the Book of Commandments, but then it was later taken out and replaced with Section 132. Could you talk about some of those polygamy rumors? I know in your book you said there was nothing in the news about them, but in 1835, Dr. Staker makes the case that, well, why would they talk about polygamy if polygamy wasn't a problem? So there must have been something going on in Kirtland in the early, at least 1830s.
The first accusation against the Latter-day Saints, they weren't called that then, against the Mormons, the Mormonites, that they that they had embraced some alternate form of marriage came in 1831. It was in conjunction with the law of consecration. And it was basically that not only did they share everything, they share their wives. That was the accusation that came up. And of course, it's easily refuted. There's nothing to support that there was ever even thought of or discussed. So when people say they were talking about polygamy in Kirtland, I would really like to see the data on that this was actually a response to polygamy, because my research shows that there was, with respect to Joseph and Fanny Alger, discussion of adultery. And that was the claim that everybody was worried about. I don't find anybody discussing polygamy during that period. And if we read the section 101, which is on marriage, it was entitled, it talks about polygamy, but it talks about fornication and adultery. And so to say that this is reacting to polygamy rumors, it could be true, but there's no evidence for that. And so I argue that this is really just a blanket statement that's covering the comments made about this idea of law of consecration and sharing wives, as well as any other accusations. And Oliver Cowdery wrote, it's a very nice declaration. He said, we haven't got anywhere near enough time to respond to all of the accusations that are being made against us. So I don't think that's a real strong argument that the article, because it mentions a man having one wife, and technically the language, if you look at it closely, does not prevent a polygamy. And we can talk about that if you want. This is not my observation. This is an observation from the RLDS Church writer, as well as President Joseph F. Smith, that the language does not actually prevent polygamy. It's a little ambiguous when it comes to that. So.
Yeah, actually, go ahead. I was just reading that just yesterday, but go ahead and finish that point.
Okay. What it says is that a woman should have but one husband, and a man,
one wife.
One wife. The language doesn't say should it be only one wife or at least one wife. I could pull up.
Yeah, go ahead and grab it.
The exact. What I have now is the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, and what it says here. It says. The Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy. We declare that we believe that one man should have one wife, and one woman but one husband. And what has been pointed out is that it doesn't say that a man should have only one wife. It doesn't say that a man should have at least one wife. And so the accusation has been made by critics and even by a church president that this was intentional language allowing for polygamy to be practiced in the future. Now, the irony of that is that this was printed twice in Nauvoo as evidence that the church was not practicing polygamy. So despite this loophole, potential loophole, do I think that Joseph put that in there intentionally? I have no idea. It wouldn't surprise me if he did, to be honest with you. I mean, he had a long view of things, and he would have known, or he may have known, again, that it was at least a correct principle from 1831. So whether it was carefully crafted or just a coincidence, if you want to disagree, and that goes for anybody listening, that's fine because we'll never resolve it.
Well, one other point I want to talk about that Dr. Staker mentioned, and I believe Dr. Richard Bennett mentioned as well, was some people believe that that section was not authored by Joseph Smith, but was authored by Oliver Cowdery. What's your opinion on that?
Do you know, in my volume 1, I go into this in some detail.
Mm-hmm.
And what we find is, yes, Joseph was gone, and yes, they were quick to get this passed. In fact, they called for this conference on Sunday to be done on Monday, and there were almost no leaders there. The quorum of the 12, there were almost no one present. The High Council wasn't really represented. The theory is that they were trying to get it pushed through before Joseph got back because Oliver had these reasons and stuff. I don't think so. And I'm grateful to Michael Marquardt for helping me. We sat one afternoon down in his basement and we went through all the documents. And what we find is that at that point in time, they needed to go forward with the printing of the Doctrine and Covenants. They had published, we think, most of the book up to section 101, which is the article on marriage, and that they're having piles of all these papers around the printing office. And so we think, or at least I think, and I think Michael agrees, that the driver at that point was really that they just wanted to get the official approval so that they could finish publishing the Doctrine and Covenants. And I don't think that they were trying to do something backhanded with Joseph. When Joseph came back, there's no evidence, I think, that he really disapproved of what had happened. In fact, he quotes or refers to the article on marriage 2 or 3 times later when he's performing marriages. He said, this declares our church's belief, which they had to have in writing in order for the elders of the church to be authorized by the state to perform state-recognized marriages. So there were a number of things. The other evidence that I found is that if you go back and look at the index of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, which was written weeks before Joseph had left Kirtland, you find that section 101 is referenced in this index. So the index was written before, and Joseph even quotes from the index, but the index didn't have page numbers. So I think that information tells me that, yes, they were planning to include it. Joseph was planning to include it. And it was just a matter of getting the printing done so they'd have a page number to put in there. But people can try this out themselves, just get an 1835 copy of the Doctrine and Covenants and look at it. And we know it was published earlier because of the timeline of some of the things that were quoted from it. So I don't ascribe to, it was actually, I think, Richard Van Wagner's book, Mormon Polygamy, that first introduced this theory. Todd Compton reiterated the possibility. He didn't jump totally on board, but I really think it's
so whether Oliver may have written it, authored it or not, it didn't seem like it bothered Joseph at all, and he was fine with it. Is that safe to say?
I believe so. I'd have to refresh my memory, but what we do know is that he could have had it rescinded. But he also quoted it as authoritative, and Michael Marquardt pointed this out to me, and I think he's even published that somewhere, that Joseph did consider it after the fact to be the official declaration of the church at that time.
Okay. Well, great. That's very good and interesting. All right. Well, let's move on to his first polygamous wife. Now, you said Fanny Alger. I've heard lots of people say Fanny Alger. Is there a correct way to say that?
A family member said it was Alger.
Alger.
And I never know how it's going to come out of my mouth. I mean, just because they say it Alger now doesn't mean they said it Alger back then. It's spelled so it could be pronounced any number of ways. And I try to remember to say Alger, but who knows how they said it. So.
All right. Well, why don't you kind of give us a brief overview for those people who may not be familiar with the story of Fanny? You know, how did she know Joseph, and how did they get acquainted, and that sort of thing?
You've already talked to Mark Staker, and he's the one I'm dependent upon to try to identify when Fanny actually arrived in Kirtland, because some people want to pair Joseph and Fanny as early as 1831 and all. Mark told me that he thinks it couldn't have been any that Fanny did not join the Smith family as a domestic in their household until at the earliest, the late 1833, and probably it was 1834. We have one witness, one testimonial, only one, so take it or, do with it as you please, that remembers Joseph saying the angel came in July of 1834. This is Mary Elizabeth Rawlins, years later, many years later, remembering this. But for me, I believe that Joseph would not have entered into plural marriage prior to that time. So I place the Fanny Alger Joseph Smith union, and I believe it was a plural marriage for a couple of reasons I'll explain. In 1835, probably late 1835, maybe early 1836. I don't think they would have been able to keep it secret from Emma for very long. To me, it's implausible that they could have been married and actually having relations, which may have occurred. There's some evidence supporting that. We just don't know. But they could have done this for very long without Emma figuring it out. She's a smart lady. So I put the marriage late 1835, early 1836, discovered, a few weeks or months later. But that timeline is completely controversial. People are willing to pick days earlier, weeks, months earlier than that timeline. But I don't think that it actually would have been much earlier than that.
Okay. So then what brought the relationship to light?
Well, and I meant to say there's a couple of reasons I think it was a marriage rather than just an adulterous relationship. We have one account, a single attestation, again, from a rather dubious source. Mosiah Hancock added a description on the end of his father's autobiography, where he describes how Levi Hancock was approached by Joseph. And Joseph said, Levi, I want to marry Fanny, so can you be an intermediary in this? And this was a pattern that was repeated in Nauvoo. Not always, but it happened. And Levi approached Fanny. Fanny said yes. And so Levi performed the marriage. It wouldn't have been a sealing. It wouldn't have been an eternal marriage, but the authority that was used by Joseph to marry people for the church, but just for time in Kirtland, that authority certainly could have been used here. And that's my theory. Again, these are unanswerable questions, and critics are quick to rush in with other alternative interpretations, and it's just insoluble.
So let me make sure I understand that. So because the marriage seems to have occurred before the vision in 1836 of Elias, Elijah, and the third person.
Moses.
Moses.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that the marriage to Fanny was probably for time only?
There are some who believe it was after April 3rd. And
The marriage occurred after April,
Yeah.
after the vision.
Yeah. And you actually can plug that in. It's plausible. Don Bradley's done some really good research, and he dates the discovery to I think it's May, June of 1836. So if the marriage occurred in, say, late April, May, June, and lasted just a few months before Emma found out, which is entirely plausible. I don't know that I embrace that, but that's, Don, at least we know when it broke up. We can date that pretty well. Then it could have been a sealing, and the authority could have been sealing authority that Joseph would have given to Levi. An alternate interpretation, and this is a question that comes up a lot, Rick, it's a good question, is if it wasn't a sealing, then what authority was used? The state wasn't going to allow Joseph to marry a second wife, so the only authority that it could have been would be priesthood authority, and Joseph was already using that authority to marry people just for time there in Kirtland. And so one interpretation is that Joseph gave that authority to Levi, and that this would have been strictly a priesthood marriage that Joseph would have argued God recognized. And so he recognized it, and Fanny and her family apparently recognized it, as did others who were involved, but not Oliver and not Emma. But the other reason that I think this was an actual marriage, the ceremony was performed, was that Eliza Snow moved in early 1836 to live with the Smiths and teach their children. In 1887, he was an independent historian, Andrew Jensen, showed up at Eliza's door and said, I'm trying to make a list of all of the wives of Joseph Smith. Well, he had been down to see Melissa Lott, and Melissa Lott had given him 13 names that he'd written down on this piece of paper. And at some point, instead of him writing down what Eliza was saying, he turned the paper over to her and gave her the pencil, and she wrote an additional 13 names. And among those names was Fanny Alger. And so my theory is that if this had been an adulterous relationship, and he also wrote a paper on Fanny where he quotes Eliza as saying she was well acquainted with Fanny, and that Fanny was the one that Emma made such a fuss about. So Eliza was there, and I think Eliza would have known the details of what was going on. She considered Fanny a wife. And so these two bits of evidence to me, I think, are convincing for me that this was in fact a marriage, probably not a sealing. And again, I place it to late 35, early 36, but no way to date it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, I'm going to reference Dr. Staker again one more time. One of the things Dr. Staker said was surprising to me, and I wanted to get your opinion on, was he said that he thought that when Peter, James, and John came in, was that 1829, 1830, and restored the Melchizedek priesthood to Joseph and Oliver, that they gave the sealing power to Joseph then. If you read the book of Matthew, it says, upon Peter, basically it sounds like he gave the sealing, I'm not quoting it right, but gave the sealing power to Peter, upon this rock I build my church, and whatever you seal on earth shall be sealed in heaven. So I guess there's a case that could be made when Joseph received the Melchizedek priesthood from Peter, James, and John. Do you think that sealing power might have come as early as 1830, or was it really 1836 with Elias, Elijah, and Moses?
It's a super question, because Brigham Young later said that if you have the apostleship, you have all the authority. And the senior apostle, of course, holds the keys to exercising all of the authority, but every apostle has all the authority. There's no other authority that can be granted except that's given to an apostle. And we're told that Peter, James, and John ordained them as apostles, and with the same calling that Paul had received, and Paul was an apostle. So that's another supportive argument for this. But there seems to be, in the economy of heaven and authority, a need for certain keys to be restored to unlock certain authorities. And you could theorize that they had the authority, but they didn't have the keys. And now it gets really messy really quick. And I don't know of anybody who's really tried to sort through all this in a way that we could consider it an orthodox.
That's actually what Mark says, that he had the authority, he didn't have the keys until 1836.
Well, if that's what Mark said, that's a really good thing then. I'm feeling good, because Mark's looked into this a lot more than I have. So.
Okay. Very interesting. All right. Well, let's go on. So somehow this relationship was discovered. You alluded to that Emma wasn't very pleased with it, and neither was Oliver Cowdery. Can you talk about their reactions and how they discovered it?
Yes, and in an appendix here in my volume 2, and I'm not trying to plug my books; they're out in paperback.
You can plug away. I'm perfectly fine with that. They're great books.
But I'll just hold this up at the camera. And I think I actually have posted this appendix on MormonPolygamyDocuments.com.org. So if you go there, I think I actually have put this up there. But the point is that there's only 19 accounts that we have that talk about Fanny. They contradict each other. They come from good sources and dubious sources. And so if somebody wants to figure out what they want to believe about Fanny, just get that appendix, read the 19 accounts, and form your own opinion. There are actually a few other important things, but those are the primary accounts that people need to know. What we understand is that more or less the people that Joseph Smith told about Fanny Alger as a plural wife, they didn't believe him. But most of the people that learned it from Fanny did believe, which is interesting. Fanny's family believed. The family that Fanny went to live with was Chauncey Webb and Eliza Jane Webb. They believed that this was an actual marriage. But Joseph is caught with Fanny, and they're in a haymow. They're in a barn. And we were out there in Kirtland with the John Whitmer Historical Association meeting this last September. And I asked Mark, I said, "Where's the barn?" He had no idea. It's long since been destroyed. But they were discovered by Emma in the act. Now, we could assume that was something sexual. I mean, some people want to say, well, it was in the act of getting married by Levi, the ceremony. Bit of a stretch. Maybe it was just in the act of something affectionate. Virtually anything affectionate would have been over the line in Emma's eyes, understandably. But she caught them, and she's not accepting Joseph's explanation at all. This is a plural marriage. God authorized it. Yeah, right. She's pretty, and I'm not. And this isn't working for me. And so Joseph, according to one of the accounts, gets Oliver and says, in the middle of the night, and says, "Oliver, come help me with this." Well, Oliver hears the story and sides with Emma and thinks Joseph is having an adulterous affair. And that was his opinion, probably right up until his death, that Joseph was not authorized to marry her. It wasn't a marriage. And he made hints to the High Council and members of the High Council that Joseph had been guilty of adultery. He did not accept any story of a marriage ceremony as being valid, and neither did Emma. Years later, in 1847, William McClellan had an interview with Emma, and Emma didn't want to talk about polygamy, but she did say, "Look, if you tell me things you heard, I'll tell you whether they're true or false." And in that conversation, she said Joseph was both an adulterer and a polygamist. Now, we don't know what she meant by that. My theory is that she never did accept Fanny as a true plural marriage and thought it was adultery, and Joseph had to seek repentance and all of that. But in my mind, that's the dichotomy. She accepted Nauvoo polygamy, but never accepted Kirtland polygamy.
So going back to that other point that I just made, so I didn't realize that Oliver kind of sided with Emma. That's kind of interesting. But would that Oliver's opinion, would that argue against the 1830 sealing power restoration and more towards an 1836? Or do you think that has any impact on that at all?
I do personally believe that even though he was there, Oliver was there receiving this authority from Elijah, Moses, and Elias, I really am not convinced that they knew what this authority was all about. And of course, there was a rift right after that. The blow up came in, according to Don, it was just weeks later. And so from that point forward, there's a rift between Joseph and Oliver. So if Joseph was receiving additional understanding about the authority, Oliver would not have been privy to any of that. So the only knowledge Oliver had of those ordinations was what they had before that point, and whatever was given in that vision, which apparently wasn't much, or if it wasn't written down. So again, I can see Oliver receiving authority he doesn't understand, and then there's a rift, and he never does gain any understanding. But Joseph, in fact, receives additional revelation during the next 4 or 5 years to help him understand it.
Well, that revelation in 1836 wasn't written down for 40 years, so it definitely took a while.
Well, they did have it in third person written down.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, they do. I mean, the critics of the church don't attack the timeline associated with the April 3rd, 1836 revelation. It was recorded, that is lost. It was turned into third person for the history just within days by, I think, Warren Parrish. And that account we do have. In fact, it was published in the Ensign by Elder Jensen, Marlon K. Jensen, when he was... So you can see it there. But it's in third person, and that was changed, so...
Okay, so it wasn't canonized for 40 years, but it was written down right away. Okay. Well, great. So what happened to Fanny? So do you know when it was discovered, and then what happened to Fanny after?
It's an interesting story, and I'm not that expert on it, but Don has them being discovered, I think it's June of 36, and Emma throws her out of the house, understandably. She goes to live with Chauncey Webb. for a matter of weeks or maybe months, until her family, who live in the northern part of the state, are able to come down and pick her up. And by September, they're on their way out. And then there's this funny story, and I think it's from Mosiah Hancock, where Fanny was being held captive in the Kirtland Temple. And so Joseph sent Levi to free her out of the Kirtland Temple. And so he backs his wagon up to the temple and she jumps from the window. Well, if you look at the heights involved, it just doesn't work. And Mosiah Hancock is not that reliable. He's got some really weird stories. So there's this story of there being a big to-do about it. And I don't know those details, but they leave in September and they go to Missouri as their destination, but they stop in Indiana. There, Fanny marries a guy named Solomon Custer. And Don theorizes that Fanny is pregnant. And that's why she jumps into this marriage so quickly. And I'm not sure I believe that to be so, but we can understand why she would, having been broken up with Joseph, and Joseph could grant a priesthood divorce as easily as he could allow for the priesthood marriage. Some people have said she couldn't have been married to Joseph because she got remarried so quickly. I don't know that I buy that. I think when they left, Joseph would have said, goodbye, and that would have been the end of the relationship. But her marrying this Solomon Custer, who apparently was a really good guy, not religious, and they settled in there in Indiana, where she lived out the rest of her life. She joined the Universalist Church. Had, I think, like 8 children, and died a member of the Universalist Church. We have some interesting stories. There's one story that after Joseph was killed, that he had told Brigham, I want you to marry all of my plural wives to make sure they get taken care of. There's one rumor, and I don't know what to think of it, that says that Brigham actually went up and told Fanny that he would marry her, even though she was already married. And yet, just to fulfill the letter of this law that Joseph allegedly told the 12. But the story doesn't say that Fanny was offended and threw him out of the house, but has her just responding that I want to be the wife of one husband, and sent Brigham on his way. But I don't know if that's true. We have a little more reliable story from Benjamin and Johnson, who said that Fanny's brother had approached her and asked her about her relationship with Brigham, or with Joseph, rather, her relationship with Joseph Smith in the marriage, and her response was simply that that's all my own affair, and didn't say anything to elaborate on it. So, but her family, Fanny's family, went to Nauvoo. The Webbs, with whom she lived, went to Nauvoo. They followed the church west, and whatever actually happened between Joseph and Fanny did not bother their faith of these people who knew the details. Same with Eliza Snow.
Now, was it true that her parents came all the way to Utah?
Her brother did, and I don't know for sure if they died or all, but they didn't leave the church. It's interesting that John Alger in 1891, this is right after the 1890 manifesto, he left the church over the manifesto. He had a polygamous wife, and he could not accept that. So again, some irony.
Fanny's brother was a polygamist,
and he left the church over the manifesto of 1890.
Wow, so, I did not know that.
Yeah,
wow, that's interesting.
I don't know how you want to read that if comparing it to 1835, but
that is very interesting. Okay, so let's we can leave Fanny alone, I guess, there for a while. Now, there was a big break in polygamous marriages. How long was that break, and who was the next wife?
Do you know, there is some evidence for Joseph marrying plural wives between 1836 and 1841. I think it's dubious, but Fawn Brodie, in her book No Man Knows My History, has several names there. But the evidence isn't totally clear that it didn't happen. I don't believe it happened, because in order for it to happen, I think Joseph had to build up a little bit of the theology of sealing. So, there just was no real timeline for this to happen. I mean, Fawn Brodie's version is just full of problems. I mean, it's bad scholarship, her timeline, and she's interpreting things wrong. But there's at least one quote saying that one of Joseph's wives was married. I think it was Lucinda Pendleton. I could be wrong, but was married before they got to Nauvoo. Again, no evidence to support that, but one late recollection from somebody who wasn't even a member of the church at the time. But for the most part, my interpretation is that there was no one he was not involved with anyone in a plural marriage between 1836 and 1841.
And it would make sense that he would take a break with Emma's reaction.
Well, that was what I was just going to say. I mean, Joseph probably got an ultimatum from Emma. If you ever do this again, we're done or something. Because Emma was a strong personality. And if she didn't accept this came from God, despite the revelations, despite the Book of Mormon, you can certainly understand why Joseph would have been reticent to jump back in. There's multiple accounts of him not wanting to do it. And the critics just, ignore them as prevarications. But I think that he really didn't want to do it because he knew what Emma was going to say when she found out, and eventually she would. So, but we fast forward to 1840s, to late 1840s, and we find several people remembering, and we're dealing with very late accounts at this point. And there's been an article by Gary Bergera talking about how the marriages were actually in 1840. I think his reasoning is problematic, and I've responded to that. I think we're very solidly in 1841, and on April 5th, Joseph was sealed this time by Joseph B. Noble, but to his sister-in-law, and that was Louisa Beeman. I will add, though, Don Bradley is doing some research now, and he is actually pushing that marriage to April of 42. And if you look at the chronology, it fits a lot better in April of 42 than 1841, because what we find is, except for Louisa, Joseph is marrying Zina Huntington and Priscinda Huntington and 4 or 5 women who all have legal husbands. Now we're getting into this polyandry question, and my theory is that Joseph was just being sealed for eternity to these women in the hopes that the angel who came a second time sometime prior to that, we don't have a date for the second visit of the angel commanding polygamy, but I theorize that he came and said, do this, and so Joseph just was doing these eternity-only non-sexual marriages because he was hoping to please the angel and also not offend Emma, who wouldn't have had to worry too much about him because there was no sexuality involved. The evidence is not absolutely conclusive, but I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that this is actually what happened in those.
Okay. So I'm glad you went there because I wanted to go to talk about polyandry. I know Dr. Lawrence Foster says that we shouldn't use that term. We should use a proxy husband, which would make sense, I guess, if there were no sexual relations. It does make you wonder, why are they doing these in the first place? Why would an angel command you to marry somebody and not have sexual relations? Because it does say that in the NC 132, it does say that one of the purposes is to raise up seed. So if you're not having sexual relations, why would an angel command such a thing?
It's a good question, and sometimes the critics will say that's the only reason, is to multiply and replenish. It's verse 63. But actually, section 132 gives 4 reasons for plural marriage, and that's one of them. But I think there's another one that's much more important. Let me talk about the other 2 before we get to the most important one. Just to reiterate, the easiest one is part of the restitution of all things. And if somebody asks you, why did Joseph do it? The easy answer is, well, he was a prophet restorer, and the old prophets did it, and he restored it. Okay, that's not entirely nuanced, and some would say isn't even correct. I think it is generally. A second one is it was a trial, and this is the one I couldn't remember. It presented a special trial. The Lord does do that. He gives different people at different times different kinds of trials. A third one was that was the one that I had talked a great deal about. It allows all men and women to enter into a marriage, even if it's as a plural wife. And then the third one was what we started with, the multiply and replenish the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So, and can I just add here, Rick, there's been a book written lately that assumes that eternal polygamy is a bad thing. And of course, on earth, polygamy is not fair. It's unequal. You could say it's sexist if you want, on earth. But I don't think that we know anything about eternal marriage, and we certainly don't know anything about eternal plural marriage. So to assume that that's a bad thing, that it victimizes women, and to assume that women should fear that, is to fear unknown things. And God has promised us everlasting joy, a fullness of joy. His plan is a plan of happiness. And I understand why even my own daughter is worried about this eternal polygamy idea. And she's told her husband, "You're going to die before me because I'm not going to die before you and have you remarry, so I'm a polygamist in heaven." She's told him that. And I get that. But at the same time, God has told us, and this is not speculation, that it's a fullness of joy. It's eternal happiness. It's exaltation for those who attain it. And I think we have to just take faith in these things that are promised us and try not to fear the unknown. And it may still be hard, but it is additional faith. I understand that, but I believe that whatever it is, and I have no desire to be a polygamist here or there, but I do believe that a woman is not going to feel victimized in eternity if she attains exaltation. And I think we just have to hold on to that and have faith that that is true, and then trust God. So I don't agree with this idea that we know what eternal polygamy is, and that we know that it's bad, and that we should fear it to hear to them.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's jump back. As we started this, we started talking about polyandry or proxy husbands. And I know recently, I believe it was last year at Mormon History Association, you had said that you thought that Joseph had sexual relations with Sylvia Sessions Lyon, if I remember the name right. DNA tests came back, and that wasn't true. So what are your opinions on that, specifically on that marriage now, as far as were there sexual relations there or not?
Do you know, the evidence, I will say, is ambiguous. But for years, and if you read my 3 volumes, I theorized that the marriage between Joseph Smith and Sylvia Sessions Lyon did include plural marriage, and I had some theories did include sexual relations in that plural marriage, and I had some theories as how that might have unfolded. When the DNA evidence came back, and part of the theory was that Joseph was the father of Josephine.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, that's an important point. But when the DNA evidence came back that Windsor Lyon was the father, it required me to rewrite things. And I'll be honest with you, it wasn't what I expected, but it was what I had hoped. It's a lot easier to understand Joseph Smith's plural marrying, particularly these sealings to already married women. It's a lot easier to understand them if he is not the father of Josephine. And I argue that the evidence is ambiguous, and that the fact that if Joseph had actually practiced polyandry, he would have been so contrary to the Bible. There's only really one direct message. Paul mentions it once, and he condemns it as adultery. It's in Romans. So the Bible condemns it, but it's also in frontier America. If a man is sexually involved with your wife, you can kill that man, and the law's not going to go after you most of the time. And we've got examples of it clear up
Happened with
until
Parley P. Pratt, right?
Exactly, Parley P. Pratt and others, where the law just was looking the other way. And it was almost expected that either the husband, or if she wasn't married, a brother or father, but some other male relative would exact corporal punishment or capital punishment on the individual who committed this. And so Joseph, if he had actually been involved with these men, he would have had to been 100% secret, worrying about his life if it was discovered, or have 100% complicity with the husband, which is not recorded in any case. And so plus it would have been beyond novel. It would have been very controversial. And so I'm saying that the little bit of ambiguous evidence that the critics have accumulated to say Joseph practiced it, and it is ambiguous. There's no unambiguous evidence saying that a woman ever believed she had 2 husbands in Nauvoo. And we're not looking for a woman saying, yeah, I had sex with him and I had sex with him. That's not going to be found. But a woman, her family, a letter, or some other communication saying that a woman actually had two husbands or defending that idea, none of that is available. And I'm arguing that if it were an actual teaching, it would have been defended and it would have been highly criticized by those who would have found it so repulsive they would have left the church or the critics would have picked up on it. We don't have anything. So I'm arguing that ambiguous evidence on something that would have been explosive is not enough for me to say Joseph practiced sexual polyandry. And that's a term that I've used a lot in the past, but just a woman having more than one husband.
So let's talk a little bit about that timeline with Sylvia Sessions Lyon. So as I recall, so she married Windsor Lyon. They were married for a time. I believe Windsor got excommunicated or something. And so it was in this period where he was excommunicated that Joseph supposedly was sealed to Sylvia.
Right.
And then perhaps they had sexual relations. I think you're telling me that's ambiguous. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Okay. So then, well, the question is, was Josephine conceived while Joseph and Sylvia were married, and that would therefore prove that he had sexual relations with her? Sounds like evidence says no, it was with Windsor. So the conception must have happened after. Well, I'm a little confused on the timeline, but supposedly she got back together with Windsor. So I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you said these were serial marriages, not polyandrous marriages, in that she had two husbands. But you're saying that she was married to Windsor. She was essentially religiously divorced, maybe not legally divorced, and then she got back together with Windsor. Is that correct?
That's what I've written in my books, and that's what I've had to rewrite. I don't
okay. You don't believe that anymore?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But if somebody is interested, if you go on YouTube, before I gave my MHA presentation, and what the MHA presentation does is gives four interpretations of the new DNA evidence. And one of them is polyandry. That's one of the four. But I also, and a second one was that there was no marriage at all, that they had no sealing or anything. And then I go through two others. I'd have to go back and look. But all of the possibilities I talk about and the evidence is supporting them. The one I came down against in that presentation, and before I gave it, I actually recorded it as a video. It's a 20-minute video.
I do remember watching it, but it's been a while.
But all the evidence, everything is there. It's still valid today. There's been nothing really new, though. Don Bradley has been out doing more research. And he hasn't found anything super helpful, except that we do know that Josephine lived close, and there's a family tradition that says that her stepsister also lived close, and she said she was present at the same time that Josephine was when Sylvia said that they are daughters of Joseph. And the question is, are they daughters physically or are they daughters spiritually? I had thought physically for Josephine, but the argument is that they were both there, so it had to be spiritually. Now that may be a little confusing, so I'll just leave you to refer people to maybe to that video and they can hear all about it. But the family tradition has been reinforced by some other things that Joseph Smith or that Don Bradley has found out about their situations. But family traditions are notorious for being false. So again, even though they've believed it for many years, doesn't mean it's true. It just supports that interpretation, which is that this was nothing more than a sealing. And the language is that Sylvia was sealed to Joseph when Windsor was out of the church. Now, if this were a polyandrous marriage, whether Windsor was out of the church or not would be unimportant. Who cares? Okay, because if it's a polyandrous marriage, she's still having relations with him, and then they get married. It would have no meaning. But if Windsor's excommunicated, and it's in November 23rd, I think, of 1843, then it was 1842. Then Sylvia can't be sealed to Windsor. So that would make perfect sense for her to seek out Joseph to be sealed to him just for the next life, an eternity-only sealing. And right now, Laura and I have gone through the evidence on these 11 polyandrous marriages. We think all of them were just for the next life. Why the women chose Joseph over their legal husbands, sometimes these men were active Latter-day Saints, we don't know. It seems odd. Okay. But it's not as odd as them practicing actual sexual polyandry without anybody ever talking about it or finding that to be controversial.
Okay.
No evidence.
So your opinion is, of all the 11 polyandrous marriages where women could have two husbands, essentially, none of them involved sexual relations?
Correct.
That's your opinion. Okay.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about, and I believe it was
Rick,
Orson.
let me interrupt,
go ahead.
though. If people go to my books, they're going to be confused because I use the word 11. The 12th polyandrous marriage on the chart is Sarah Ann Whitney to Joseph C. Kingsbury, which was a front marriage. Everybody involved with that realized that she was sealed to Joseph, but apparently there was some legal issues going on. So Joseph asked Kingsbury to just have a legal marriage, but not consummate the marriage. And everybody agrees that was the relationship. That's number 12. And number 13 is Lucinda Pendleton, who we know just nothing about. And the fourth one is Mary Herron, who we have one attestation that connects her and Joseph sexually, but we don't know any of the details. So if somebody goes to my chart, there's actually 14 women on that.
Oh, okay.
But 11 of them, we believe, were eternity only. 2 are just undocumented. So we just take your guess. And then we have this pretend marriage with Sarah Ann. So 14 total women.
Well, great. Well, let's talk. I believe it was either Orson Hyde or Orson Pratt. I always get those two mixed up. One of them, Joseph sent on a mission, and then supposedly married his wife while he was on a mission. Can you talk about that story?
It's a great story. In 1842, John C. Bennett wrote a book called History of the Saints. And if we wanted to take a minute, I just bought an original copy of it, I have it upstairs.
It's
thousands of dollars, but
oh my goodness.
it's the act, and it's got writing from 1842 in it. It's pretty exciting to me. But in that book, he says that Joseph would send men on missions and marry their wives. Well, of the 14 women, we know that 11 of them, their husbands were not on missions. 2 of the men, we don't have a date for the marriage, so we can't say. The only one of them that we know was on a mission was Orson Hyde. Orson Hyde went to Palestine with the 12. We all know the story. Over a year later, we have a sealing date between him and Orson Hyde's wife, Miranda.
Between Joseph and Miranda.
The problem is we have 2 sealing dates for Joseph and Miranda. The other date is from an affidavit that Miranda signed that is well after Orson Hyde returning from Palestine. So even the one that appears to be a case where Joseph might have sent him on a mission, but then he waits a year. I mean, it doesn't make sense. But a year later, we have Joseph being sealed to Miranda. But again, we even have a second date. So we don't, and the second date is a signed affidavit, which we probably would consider to be more reliable than something that was just scrawled on a page of Joseph's journal, not in his handwriting, but in, I think, Thomas Bullock's. But again, that story is false, and yet it's a sound bite. It's all over the internet. We've got to kill it. It's wrong. It's false. Joseph did not send men on missions so he could marry their wives, according to any reliable documentation.
I've always heard that was reliable, so that's interesting. All right. So let's see. So he had 14 potentially polyandrous marriages. He had the one with Fanny. What about the other? How many are there?
By my count, he was sealed to 35.
35.
But by my dear wife's count, it was 33, which corresponds to Todd Compton's 33. Todd had some additional possible wives and all. I don't think any of them. Mary Herron was on that list, actually, but not Esther Dutcher, which is the 30.
So these are other young women. Let's talk a little bit about Mary Rollins Leitner, because both she and Fanny were quite young. How old were they approximately when these happened?
Mary Elizabeth Rollins was not young when she was sealed to Joseph. She wasn't a teenager.
Oh.
Are you...
the Gospel Topics essay references someone who were young, under 15, I think. So they were 14 years old.
You're probably thinking of Helen Mar Kimball.
Oh, that's who I'm thinking.
There are 2 14-year-olds. The other 14-year-old was Nancy Maria Winchester. And we don't know anything about that relationship when it happened. She may have been 15. My bet is she was 14. But Helen Mar Kimball is the one 14-year-old. And for several reasons, I don't believe that relationship was consummated. But Joseph gets accused of all kinds of crazy things. People even call him a pedophile. Now, a pedophile is someone who's interested in children under 11, which would not apply to Joseph in the wildest of rumors. But he was sealed to probably two 14-year-olds and a 16-year-old.
Was that Fanny,
And,
the 16-year-old?
No, Fanny was, depending upon when you want to date it, 17 to 19. By my dating, she was 19.
Okay.
But some people push it to 33, and she had been 17. But the 16-year-old was Flora Ann Woodworth. And actually, Flora was divorced from Joseph. Most people don't know this. She had a blow up with Emma, Flora did, and Joseph had given Flora a gold watch. And Emma demanded the watch. We don't know how Emma found out about it, but according to the very sketchy notes that we have, Emma took the watch and smashed it, destroyed it underfoot. And the next day, after this confrontation, and we're indebted to William Clayton for some of these details for the timeline, but Flora went out and married a non-member, Carlos Gov. And there were conversations with Joseph and Flora, and then Helen Mar was the one who reported that actually they separated. There's essentially a divorce between Joseph and Flora, which is the only one that we're aware of all of these. But Flora later said she intended to cling to the prophet, suggesting that maybe it wasn't a full divorce, just a for-time divorce or something. So again, we're working with some sketchy details, but the language would certainly support that. But getting back to the 14-year-olds, we only know about Helen. But gratefully, Helen lived a long time. And she wrote more supporting Joseph and plural marriage than any other woman in the church in the 19th century. So whatever happened with her and Joseph did not cause her to lose faith in Joseph or even in plural marriage. But what we know from pretty good sources, from her primarily, was that her husband was Heber C. Kimball, and Heber C. Kimball wanted to please Joseph or create some kind of a family bond. So Heber C. Kimball taught Helen and then offered Helen, according to Helen's words, like a ewe lamb, to Joseph. And Joseph taught her plural marriage and agreed to be sealed. And you could say, why didn't Joseph just tell her to wait? We don't know the answer to that. But what we can piece together from what Helen wrote was that the sealing occurred. And after the sealing, Helen continued to go to dances and balls and socialize for the next several months until at one point Joseph stepped in and said, look, we don't want her doing this anymore. And later, Helen said that she hated polygamy. I mean, she wrote this down early on. This was one of the early writings before she wrote her books defending it. But the reason she hated polygamy was not because of her own relationship with it, but because of how it affected her mother. And I argue that if she were having conjugal relations with Joseph and finding that to be undesirable, she might have actually used her relationship with Joseph as a reason for hating polygamy. But the real question that comes up is, if the marriage was consummated, and I don't think it was, why did they not call Helen to be a witness in the 1892 Temple Lot case? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Talk about it.
It's kind of a fun little episode, and let me digress for just a minute, because Don Bradley pointed this out at one point. He's written an article on it. If it had not been for the RLDS Church, they started in 1860. And they had two primary issues. One was that the president of the church had to be genetically related to Joseph Smith. And so Joseph Smith III, his son, was the first president of the RLDS Church. But their other big thing was Joseph wasn't a polygamist. And so they started sending missionaries out to Utah in the late 1860s and through the 1870s. And so what did the church do? The LDS Church in Salt Lake decided, we're going to document what happened back in Nauvoo, because nobody was writing about it, almost. And so in 1869, Joseph S. Smith collected dozens of affidavits, other stories, testimonials. All this stuff was collected. Why? To counter the claims of the RLDS Church. 1887, Andrew Jensen, as an independent researcher, collects all these stories, didn't know about the 1869 affidavits, so he creates this other cache of accounts talking about Nauvoo polygamy. And then in 1892, we find this lawsuit. And what was happening is that the Hedrikites, they like to be called Church of Christ Temple Lot, but they followed originally a guy named Hedrick.
Granville Hendrick.
Yeah. And they owned the Temple Lot. They physically were there, and the RLDS Church had just gained possession of the Kirtland Temple by suing the people that were living in it or owned it and saying that we are the original church, so we still own it. And even though they really didn't prevail, is my understanding, in the court, because the winners of the Kirtland Temple.
Kirtland or Independence?
I'm talking Kirtland now, because it segues into Independence.
Because the Hedrickites are in Independence, right?
Right,
so
right.
I get confused there.
Yeah, sorry. It's good to clarify. But in Kirtland, my understanding is that the lawsuit, the RLDS Church lost it. But they read the decision by the judge, and they ran out of the court yelling, "We won, we won." And they just pushed the owners who actually had won the suit out and just took possession of it, because the people who won the suit and were in possession didn't understand that they had won it. And so they just kind of, by default, just took over the Kirtland Temple.
The Temple Lot people, the Hedrickites, took over the Kirtland Temple?
No, this is the RLDS Church.
The RLDS
Church wanted to start getting ownership of these places, so they sued the people who owned the Kirtland Temple. They lost, but they said they won, and they took possession of it. And so their next quest was to take possession of the Independence Lot. Well, that was a little different, because at this point, the Utah Church didn't want them to win. There was a lot of animosity between the two groups, the RLDS and the Utah Church. And so even though the Hedrickites did not practice polygamy, the Utah Church helped the Hedrickites prove, or attempt to prove, that Joseph Smith taught polygamy. Polygamy was part of the original church, and the RLDS don't practice polygamy, so they aren't the same church as Joseph Smith organized. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's a little complicated, but that was the primary argument. Polygamy was the major issue in all of the discussion. Is if the RLDS Church is the same church, then they've got to prove Joseph wasn't a polygamist. And so we have several accounts, they're very late, but giving us additional details about Nauvoo polygamy. And so if we didn't have the RLDS Church saying Joseph wasn't a polygamist, we wouldn't have the 1869 affidavits, we wouldn't have the 1887 collection by Andrew Jensen, and we wouldn't have the additional information from the Temple Lot case. Together, those three are 75% of what we know. And it's scary for a researcher on polygamy to think about what we would know about Nauvoo polygamy if the RLDS Church had not taken the stance that they did. It's really scary. You'd have John C. Bennett, you'd have William Law, and you would not know even a fraction of what we think we know or about it today. So what happened in the Temple Lot case, this is 1892, the Hedrickites and the RLDS show up with their attorneys, and they're taking depositions of LDS Church members that are helping the Hedrickites say Joseph was a polygamist, the RLDS Church is not the same church. And so they called Joseph had 9 plural wives that were still living, okay? 3 of them had been polyandrous wives. They were not called. Why is that? Was the church too embarrassed about polyandry, or was it because these were eternity-only marriages that were non-sexual and wouldn't have done anything to help the Hedrickites' case? The Hedrickites wanted to prove Joseph was a full-fledged polygamist with sexual relations in some of his marriages. Well, they did call 3 wives. All 3 of them testified that they had sexual relations with Joseph. And
3 wives who were not polyandrous.
Not polyandrous. There were 9 total. 3 were polyandrous, not called. 3 of them were called. And what's interesting is they all testified of having relations with Joseph. But Helen Mar Kimball was not called. She was one of the 3 that weren't called. And yet she lived very close to where the depositions were being taken. She could have gone down there. She knew about them. It's in the journal. Her journal talks about them being in town and doing this. And my argument is that the reason they didn't call Helen wasn't because she was 14 and they'd have been embarrassed. I mean, a 14-year-old marriage was eyebrow-raising, but it wasn't scandalous in Nauvoo, and I would think even in Utah in 1890. But the real reason was that Helen could not say that she had relations with Joseph. This was just an unconsummated sealing at that point, just like the polyandrous ones. And so that's why these 4 women were not called, but the 3 that they did call, they were very pointed. Did you have carnal intercourse with Joseph? I mean, the language would have made them terribly uncomfortable because these were Victorian women, embracing a very conservative belief system. And they would not have liked to talk about it, but they did. And so when I put all these pieces together, that Joseph did not seek the marriage with Helen, he did go along, didn't seek it, and by several evidences, I don't believe that it was consummated. These claims that Joseph was going after these 14-year-olds really is not sustained from a documentary standpoint.
Okay, so why wouldn't Joseph? I know there's a story in Nauvoo where Emma offered Jane Manning James, a black servant in the Smith household, to be adopted as a daughter. Why do you think that they didn't offer the same thing with Helen Mar Kimball?
There were no adoptions performed during Joseph's lifetime. The only adoptions that we have any record of occurred in the Nauvoo temple, and they're around, depending upon your definition of an adoption, there's 205 or something. But a lot of these, I use the word adoption to mean a child is sealed to parents who they're not biologically related.
Right.
I mean,
I know John D. Lee was sealed to Brigham as a son, even though John was older than Brigham.
Right.
But that was after the Nauvoo period.
Actually, John D. Lee was the only non-church leader who went into the Nauvoo temple and had non-relatives sealed to him as their children. There were like 22 men and women. He got this idea, and it persisted for several years, that you gained some eternal advantage if you had more children, either biologically or through adoption. And so he put all these people together. They were all there in this big company. This is brand new stuff. The leaders are going, we don't know about adoption because it didn't happen from Joseph. I don't think Joseph really told them much about it, and they're just figuring it out as they go. But what's interesting is within a year or two, all of these relationships had asked Brigham to have it be broken off. John D. Lee was thinking all of these children were going to take care of him as their parent, and all of these children were thinking John D. Lee was going to take care of them as his children. And so when it finally came out, nobody wanted to be part of John D. Lee's family. And my understanding is, and I haven't researched it in detail, but I think they were all left John D. Lee. And of course, once the Nauvoo temple was closed, there were no sealings, adoption sealings. Now, Dick Bennett and I were together just a week ago. We laughed a little because he and I have been on opposite sides of, well, were there sealings in winter quarters? And he said there was probably. And I'm saying, I don't think you can do that outside of a temple. Brigham was very explicit that you couldn't do those outside of a temple. And so the adoption issue is something that wasn't available in Nauvoo, to answer your question.
Okay. So you're saying that they're just and I don't know when Helen Mar Kimball was sealed to Joseph, but that just wasn't really an option in that year to be sealed as a child rather than as a wife?
Well, they didn't have a temple. And you can't do adoption sealings outside of a temple.
Adoption sealings. Okay, so therefore it had to be a plural marriage because that could be done outside a temple.
Right.
Oh, really?
Yeah. No, I call them horizontal marriages, husband and wife. Those sealings can be done outside of a temple, but they're supposed to be done again either by proxy or by the same people again in the temple. But they are valid
when you have
outside.
a temple.
Right,
Yeah.
when you have one. But the vertical teachings of a child to sealings, vertical sealings, child to parent, can only be done in a temple setting. And while there's some questionable things with John Bernheisel and perhaps some others in winter quarters, I think they were really consistent in that. And Brigham only allowed it. So none of them occurred until 1877. They had the endowment house in Utah and Salt Lake. They did not perform any adoptions, and Dick and I agreed on that they didn't.
But there were some adoptive sealings in Nauvoo before they left west.
Right, but it's also confusing because in the months and years after that, there was a lot of talk about people increasing their kingdoms on earth, but all they could do was get promises from families to be in George Albert Smith's family or in Party Pratt's family or somebody else, Willard Richards' family. And so there was a period of time where there was this idea that these men were getting some eternal advantage, and so were the people being in their families. But these things were not sealed through an ordinance in the temple. These were just promises, most of which just were forgotten because it was many years later that they were able to do the adoption ordinances in the St. George Temple.
Okay. All right. Well, this is great. So let's go back to, I guess, 132 once again. I keep going back there. So it does say that polygamy was around to raise up seed. So why do you think there were no offspring, or at least no known offspring, of Joseph and a polygamous wife?
Again, a great question. And I had theorized, and if you read my books, you'll find there are two that I thought were Joseph's. Josephine being one. We know by DNA that wasn't. The other one is, and there's an account from Joseph Lee Robinson saying that Joseph and Olive Frost had a child. And it was a single attestation, and I had discounted it. But then I heard an interview read between Joseph F. Smith and a guy named Whitehead, blocking on his first name. He was a secretary to Joseph in Nauvoo. He arrived kind of late, but he could write and helped out there. So he was close enough to know what was going on. And I heard the interview read. It hasn't been published, even still. And I interpreted that as being that Joseph had a wife, Olive Frost, and they had a child. Well, since that day and night, that was what I was going on when I wrote my book. That the transcript of that interview has been released, and John Hayashek owns that, and he's a friend and allowed that transcript to come out. It's clear the child was between Olive and Brigham. Brigham Young married several of Joseph's wives after the martyrdom. The timeline only allows Brigham.
Was that passed to you up at Mormon History?
Yeah,
I remember that.
It came in on my phone as a text message from John because I said, John, I really want to make sure what I'm saying here is accurate. And so he sent it to me, nice guy, that he is, and I was able to verify what I had already written up and made into slides as being accurate. And so we drop Olive's child. We don't even know the gender because both she and the child died before they left Nauvoo. And then we take Josephine off the table, and that just leaves accusations and not a single documented child to Joseph. At least, I think, 7 of them have been disproven through DNA, and the others are pretty dubious. But I have a chart. It's at josephsmithpolygamy.org. It's at Mormon Polygamy Documents as well, but you can find it there where I've got them all listed. There's like 20 accusations. And what Don Bradley and I have done over the years is we've tried to trace these down. And what we find is that if a family can tie Joseph to be the father of some child, if he's anywhere within 50 miles of when this child's conceived, some of these families are just willing to accuse Joseph. And in one case, there were people leaving the church because they were so appalled by the fact that Joseph had this child, and then DNA comes out and shows it isn't. So rumors can be very strong in families, and we have to be really careful with them. But there's no documented children.
Okay, but you do hold, even though with the polyandrous wives, there was probably, you're saying there was probably no sexual relations. There were sexual relations with others, just no offspring.
Again, in Appendix E, I compiled all of the evidences that had been available to that point. Of course, it doesn't have the DNA now to disprove the one, but I show 12 possible evidences of sexuality with 12 of the wives. Some of the evidence is deposition level, signed attestation type of thing, and some of it is really dubious. But there's no evidence for more than 12. Personally, I believe he probably had 2 that went by other names, and DNA could 2 children by the plural wives. There is one account by George A. Smith, I think, where he recounts how he came up to Joseph, and the account is that he approaches Joseph and he says, "What's up?" So I guess they had the same kind of I don't know, conversational words that we have here. But what's up? And Joseph is washing his hands, saying that Emma served as a midwife, and one of his plural wives had just delivered a baby. And this very easily could have been, say, between September of 43 and Joseph's death, because he had several plural wives living in the Nauvoo mansion under the watchful eye of Emma. And we don't know anything about the dynamics of that home. I mean, Emma could have just kept them separate all the time, or she could have allowed some interactions. We don't know. But if you want to look at a timeline, she may have actually felt okay about polygamy and allowed and participated in this as a midwife. Again, speculation, but that account was repeated several times by and it wasn't George Albert Smith's. I'm blocking on which of his leaders. He was a polygamist, but left this story. But you put that with Mary Elizabeth Rawlins' recollection of 2 or 3 children by Joseph's plural wives. What you find is scattered evidences from pretty good sources, but they're late, but documenting that Joseph had at least 1, if not 2 or 3 children, but we have no idea who they are.
Well, let's talk about Emma again. So, as I understand it, on her deathbed, she said that Joseph never practiced polygamy. How do you, why do you think she denied that? Was that just she didn't want to believe it, or she didn't want her children to believe it, or what do you think?
Just months before she died, Joseph Smith III asked her a series of questions, and it took several days to get these answers recorded. And they were recorded by Joseph Smith III. Joseph Smith III. And in that set of questions, she said some things that are really important historically. This is where we learn about Joseph Smith dictating the Book of Mormon and then taking a break and coming back and starting off right where he left off, and details that we hold to be very important. Well, one of the questions was Joseph a polygamist? And she denies that he had any other wives than her. And there has been some theories that she may have had some senility and just meant it but had forgotten. That's Mark Staker's take on it.
Oh.
He shared that with me, and it will be in a book that he's working on. Lawrence Foster, who you also quoted, a very good polygamy scholar, he theorizes that the questions were phrased so that there could be plausible denial. In other words, you're going to deny polygamy, but it's not talking about celestial marriage. As I look at the questions, I don't really see that parsing of words to allow that, but Larry's a smart guy, and that's how he kind of rationalizes Emma's denial. I have an article that I've been pitching to different people to publish on the denials. And to be quite honest with you, there are at least 2 other denials that clearly were not senility, were clearly not specially phrased questions, where Emma just comes right out, and they're fairly well documented, said Joseph did not practice polygamy. And how do I deal with that? I don't know. I do not have a good explanation. I think Emma was an amazing woman. I look forward to meeting her someday. In our theology, that's a possibility. She had the worst row to hoe of all polygamous wives, in my view. She did remarkably well. She stumbled, but I believe there's plenty of forgiveness on these things for her. And but I honestly don't know how she was able to say the things that she said. Hopefully these will be published. I put them together. I just haven't got them published yet. But it's pretty clear that she just denied it flat out, and I don't know how she made that work for her. But they're there.
Well, there's another book, Joseph Fought Polygamy. I think the price is.
It's right over there.
You've got
on my shelf.
So I would assume that they would quote Emma quite a bit as well. I've been surprised that I know Rock Waterman has been somebody who's kind of bought into this. it boggles my mind why anybody would say that Joseph never practiced polygamy. But, talk about what are some of the justifications for that, and then why are those justifications incorrect?
It's interesting, Rick, that you would bring that up now, because by the time this interview is aired, the Interpreter will have published a very long article that I've written,
Hmm.
where I don't just give evidence that Joseph did it, but I actually attack the arguments I mentioned Rock Waterman, I mentioned the Prices, and then Denver Snuffer, who is, in my view, just the latest false prophet. And remember, I started looking at Mormon fundamentalism, and I documented and wrote articles on men who came as great leaders, or great for this reason or that reason, and then they just fall by the wayside. And there's a number of these that I talk about in my book. And I think Denver is just the latest in all of this type of a pattern. But for those who have questions, the easiest way probably to detect Denver is he said Joseph didn't practice polygamy, and then just look at the evidence. And I outline it all here. It is true that most of the evidence that Joseph practiced plural marriage is from late sources, but not all of it. The novel expositor states right in there that Joseph Smith had a revelation. It was read to the High Council. We've got testimonials from William Law and Jane Law saying that Joseph was teaching polygamy. These are contemporaneous. There are entries in William Clayton's journal. John C. Bennett clearly had heard some rumors. I don't think he was ever in confidence of Joseph with it. But to say that it's all old is not true. There are some very important contemporaneous sources. And then you've got a whole truckload of late sources from dozens and dozens of people who must have either been in a huge conspiracy or Joseph was practicing it and actively teaching it. I also, in that, have a section on Section 132. People say it was doctored up or something like that. It is true that the William Clayton version was destroyed. We don't know exactly how. There's contradictory evidences there. Did Emma burn it, or did she insist that Joseph burn it? I mean, the differences are not huge, but it clearly was destroyed. But there had been a copy made. And this is by Joseph C. Kingsbury. He did it. He was a penman. He could write. And in that day, if you could write with a good pen, a good handwriting, that sets you apart, because not everybody was that literate in the Nauvoo era. And so he wrote this down at Bishop Whitney's request, and he kept that. This is Helen's father. He kept it in a notebook until 1847, when he was asked to give this to Brigham. And we have an account from Horace Whitney, who wrote it down, copied it, and that copy they still have, I guess. I don't know, but the copy that Joseph C. Kingsbury wrote down is available online. You can find it on the Joseph Smith Papers Project. I've reposted it too. But if you look at it, it's clearly in Kingsbury's hand. It's not been doctored up. There's no evidence that anybody was editing it or making changes in it or anything like the accusations are saying. And we've got testimonies from Clayton and Kingsbury that this is the actual document that Joseph dictated that day. So it dates back to 1843. The provenance is very good. The idea that Brigham had it written up or something is not supported by any kind of evidence. So this is the first time I think anybody has actually written down a provenance of the Kingsbury copy. And there may be some details we wish we had, but it's really pretty clear that Whitney kept it until 1847, and Brigham had it, and he published it in 1853 to try to bring in some other scenario to support Denver Snuffer's version or something. Just, it's a contrivance. There's just no way to do it from a historical documentation standpoint, in my view.
Okay. So you mentioned, as far as the revelation, so do you think Joseph had an idea that Emma would throw that in the fire, and that's why they made 2 copies of Section 132?
I think it's a coincidence that there was a second copy made. The accounts don't say Joseph was pushing for this. Hiram was involved, but they wanted copy, and so they just allowed it to happen. So then there were two copies running around, and we have numerous accounts from people saying they saw it. They read the copy, and we can't ever tell, was this the Clayton copy or it had been destroyed and this was the Kingsbury copy? My guess is that most of these accounts are talking about the Clayton copy before it was destroyed, because the Kingsbury copy was not circulated.
So Clayton wrote a copy, Kingsbury wrote a copy, and the Clayton copy got thrown in the fire by Emma.
Right.
The Kingsbury copy stayed. Okay.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Now, one other question, since you mentioned Denver Snuffer. I read his book, and in his book, he mentioned that he thought that D&C 132 was actually 4 different revelations received at different times, and essentially Brigham Young conflated them all together. That there was the eternal marriage, which was basically monogamous, and then there's the polygamy revelation, if I'm remembering this right. Then there's the message to Emma, where it says, if you don't accept this, you're going to be destroyed. And I'm trying to remember what the 4th one was. What is your opinion on that? Do you think that's true, that this could have been 4 separate revelations that were conflated together as a single revelation?
Well, the idea that the revelation can be divided into 3 or 4 sections is not new. People have been saying that for decades. Okay. And the way you divided it up is quite exact. You go up, you have eternal marriage mentioned up till about 32. Then there's some discussion about polygamy, old time polygamy, Old Testament polygamy, and then we launch in. I think it's around verse 51 to Emma, that takes up the next 15 verses. Yeah, till well, you could actually divide it at 61, but she's mentioned again in I think 64. So those are the 3 or 4 divisions that are typically made, and we don't know when they were received, but by every account we have, it was dictated from verse 1 to 66. You've got to start speculating and making up a history if you want to say that part of it was dictated here and another part was made up here and then it came together. There's just nothing to support that historically. Clayton said he wrote it down completely. Kingsbury in one session. It's in his journal. It's in Joseph's journal. I mean, there's contemporaneous evidence in 2 places that a revelation was written on July 12, 1843, and it dealt with polygamy. And then you've got the Kingsbury copy, which goes from beginning to end. And people can make up their own historical fictions. But if we make those a basis for our belief system, we're going to get into trouble. And if you want to disagree with me or with this account, that's great, but bring some evidence. Everybody wins. We may not agree at the end of it, but at least we'll be looking at documents that can help us find the truth, rather than just speculations that come out of the air, as near as I can tell.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I know I've taken a lot of time, and I really appreciate you've been very gracious here. Last question I had. Are there any? You mentioned the interpreter. You've got something coming up on the interpreter. Are you working on any other books or projects that you'd like to share with us?
Well, actually, yes, I am. I've kind of shifted gears. I had somebody ask me just last week. That's Chris Smith. Chris, he's got his PhD, nice guy. He said, are you still writing on polygamy? And I paused for a minute. I thought, I don't know what more there is to write. I'd love to write some more on polyandry. Dan Vogel and I have been having kind of a public disagreement on that topic, and there's no new evidence. He's not brought forth any, and I don't have any really to offer some of the things I alluded to here, but I'd love to see some new things come out on polyandry, and I would write on that. But pretty much I think everything that can be said without new evidence is kind of been said. So, but the thing that I would add as a response to your question, Rick, is that I've never been really comfortable with the naturalists' explanation of the text of the Book of Mormon. If you can see up here, maybe you can't, but there's all these versions of the Book of Mormon up here, the different printings year by year. And if you look at the naturalist view, it's this that Joseph got up one day and just started to dictate this text, the 116 pages, and then there's a pause, and then we go to Oliver Cowdery shows up, and then over a period of just a few weeks, he dictates 273,725 words by my count of the Book of Mormon text. That's the 1830 version. And I've just never been comfortable that Joseph could have dictated that. And so I've been investigating the different theories about that. I've written an article that I hope to have published. But in this article, what I did is I compared Joseph to other 24-year-old or younger authors who wrote big books. And I compared their education, I compared the word counts and the complexity of their books. And when you line them all up, 24 years and older, Joseph was 23 when he dictated it, but it was published a year later at 24. And I have to use the publishing dates of these other books, okay, because they're obviously written before. But the biggest book written by anybody 24 or under is about 180,000. Joseph's book is almost 50% longer, okay?
180,000 words?
180,000 words versus 273,000. And then when you look at the complexity, and in fact, I've got them on the shelf here somewhere, but one of the books is it's just really simplistic. I tried to read it, but it's just, I couldn't get in. It's written for like a 7th grader or an 8th grader, but it's 180,000 words. And then there's a series by a guy named Christopher Paolini, the Aragon series is independent series it's called, but he wrote 2 books that were very long before the age of 24. But again, when you get into the text, this is just pretty simplistic stuff, I mean, the names and everything are very, very different, not nearly as complex. There's no chiasmus or stylometric issues like with the Book of Mormon. So Joseph Smith is just curiously unique as an author of this Book of Mormon. And so I'm kind of focusing not only on the word count, but also the way it was presented, because the numbers don't lie. When people want to say, oh, Tolkien wrote a book and that's just like Joseph writing the Book of Mormon, or Shakespeare had all these plays that are very complex, and that's just like Joseph Smith. When you get into the details, Joseph is unique. There is no one like Joseph who has come up with a book like the Book of Mormon. And that's what the evidence is showing. And in fact, when I was putting this chart together, I actually posted it on Ex-Mormon Reddit. I thought, if there's something wrong with this, because the Book of Mormon is way out. It's just different. Whatever you want to say the reasons are, Joseph, as an author at age 23 or 24 of the Book of Mormon, he's different from any other author that I could identify. And they actually found one other author that was important. It was Paolini, but there's still nothing there. And so I'll be interested on the critics' view of these articles and things when they come out that I'm working on. And believe me, it's so much nicer than working on the controversial polygamy. I'm very happy to just be having fun with the Book of Mormon and how it has come forth. So
that's cool. I just remembered 2 more questions I wanted to ask you. The Gospel Topics essay. I understand, I was reading a blog post that I guess Elder Marlon Jensen recently said that basically they commissioned a bunch of scholars to kind of write a big essay, and then the church would kind of condense those down. I was just wondering, did you have anything to do with those Gospel Topics essays on polygamy?
Oh, yeah. I gave them a very long essay, and then maybe a couple of years later, they sent me the Gospel Topic essay that was similar to what we have today, and I went through it all, and we I think had one other meeting in the interim, maybe 2, but I just went through and made recommendations on it, and every recommendation I recommended in the text, they accepted. There were some outside comments that I made some recommendations they did not, but they were very generous to allow me to do that. They do quote from the trilogy a number of times, and an article that I wrote is also referenced.
So that took a few years for that whole process to go through?
Yes, originally they were thinking of doing long answer, medium answer, short answer. That was the first thing that was asked of me on the topic of polyandry. And then then I just sent them some general stuff, and I don't know how many iterations it went through there. Again, I was excited to contribute to that, and I only looked at the Nauvoo material. I know that they had, I know Catherine Danes helped out, and Kathleen Flate, I think, also, are the other 2 that did the other input on plural marriage. I hope they don't mind me saying that, but they wanted outsiders. to critique it. I mean, if there were problems, they wanted to know about them before they published it.
Cool. And then my last question was, I know you're an active Latter-day Saint. You used to sing in the Tabernacle Choir. I would always tell my wife had a big goal that she would like to sing in there, and I'm like, I know that guy.
Good luck.
Anyway, I'm just curious, do your ward members know that you've written this big 3-volume set, and do they ever ask you questions, or do they just not care?
Most of them don't know. We were at a ward party one time, and we were sitting by some younger couples that I didn't know because they just split our ward or rearranged the ward boundaries, and there was a young gal sitting right across from me, and she goes, "Wait, you're Brian Hales." She was really surprised, and actually she'd run into my CES letter material because I've got a website that I think exposes the CES letter, and so she was surprised that way. But overall, I think most of them don't know. Craig Foster, who is also a polygamy scholar, especially on fundamentalism, he's in my ward, and we were just talking on Sunday, and we just said, nobody in here really knows that we're doing all this controversial stuff. The bishop knows, and our stake president knows, and of course they're very supportive. But no, it's just what I tell people is if you don't have a problem with polygamy, then just don't worry about it. I mean, it's hard to make polygamy make you feel good because of how unfair it is on earth. And so if I don't even tell them about my books because it can create, questions and things that if their faith is good without it and all, I don't think they need to know every nuance about what's happened historically. On the other hand, I do advise people to inoculate themselves and their families so that the first place, if they see it on the internet, they've said, "Oh yeah, I know about that." And I'll plug my wife's book, A Reason for Faith, 17 chapters by an expert on all of the controversies in the church. I highly recommend that people buy that. A Reason for Faith. It comes as a CD as well. But Paul Reeve, who you interviewed, he wrote the chapter on race and priesthood. Laura and I did 2 chapters on polygamy. But there's Book of Abraham, Kinderhook Plates, homosexuality. Richard Bushman did a chapter on treasure digging. So at least if you've read a book like that, and it's not a big book, it's an easy read. At least you're kind of inoculated to these kinds of things. So if you have a question, you don't have to panic. Oh yeah, I never heard of that kind of thing.
So does the bishop and stake president ever send people your way? So straighten these people out?
Actually, we meet with quite a few.
Oh, really?
People, and they some of them come with faith, and we can give answers, and then they go away happier. I mean, it isn't an easy, click your fingers, I'm doing better thing. But we always tell people just keep learning, be transparent, learn everything. Don't give up till you've learned. You don't have to give up faith today. Find out what's going on. You can read the antis, but read the answers, read the responses. And yet other times when Laura and I meet with people, it's just, I think, a box that they have to check as they're on their way out of the church. Oh yeah, I met with the Hales, they didn't help. And so they'd kind of already given up their faith. But the only thing I would say is if you've got questions, dive in. I believe there's somebody in the church who knows more about it than the person who wrote whatever you're reading on the internet, and they still believe. Mm-hmm. And with respect to plural marriage, we certainly have read a lot. And it strengthened my belief in Joseph. It didn't make me like polygamy. I'd never want to do it. But my belief in him as a true prophet has just been strengthened.
Oh, great. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this time that you've spent here with me on Gospel Tangents. And if I have any more questions, can I call you again?
Sure.
All right. Thanks a lot.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, we'll see you. I hope you enjoyed our interview with Dr. Brian Hales. Brian, once again, thank you so much for sitting down with me, and we really appreciate the amazing work you've done and the wonderful interview that we did. So thanks again. In our next conversation, I'm excited to introduce Rich Hanks. He's a biography of his father, Marion Hanks, who served as a general authority.
My name's Rich Hanks. I am the son of Marion D. Hanks. Here's the book. This came out, I guess it's been about 6 months now. Dad was a general authority of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for just under 40 years.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.